Thembeka Dlamini had only wanted to do the right thing. But on a crowded Johannesburg street, honesty turned into humiliation within seconds. Her little son clung to her skirt as security guards shouted that she had stolen the billionaire's briefcase. Strangers pointed phones rose and shame burned across her face while she tried to explain through tears. Then the owner himself arrived, cold, powerful, unreadable. He reached for the briefcase, opened it, and suddenly went still. Inside was not just money or documents, but something that tied this poor single mother to a secret he had buried for years. And in that moment, everything began to change. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories of pain, justice, and unexpected hope move your heart, subscribe and stay with us. Morning in Johannesburg did not arrive gently, where Thembeka Dlamini lived. It came with the scrape of metal doors, the bark of impatient voices, the hiss of paraffin stoves, and the coughing engines of taxis already fighting for space on the road, before the sun had fully climbed into the sky. In the narrow row of weathered rental rooms behind a mechanic's yard in Yeppestown, the day always seemed to begin in the middle of somebody else's struggle. A baby cried through one wall, a couple argued through another, and somewhere outside a woman was already calling out the price of tomatoes in a voice sharp enough to cut sleep in half. Thembeka was awake before all of it. She sat on the edge of her thin mattress for a moment, listening to her son breathe. Luthando lay curled beneath a faded blue blanket, one small arm flung over his face, still lost in the deep and forgiving sleep that children somehow found even inside difficult lives. Thembeka watched him with the quiet attention of a mother who measured every morning first by whether her child had slept in peace. His cheeks were soft, his lips slightly open, his breath warm and even. He was 6 years old, but sometimes when she looked at him sleeping, she saw the baby he had once been, fragile and hungry, and entirely dependent on a world that had never promised kindness. She stood carefully tying a scarf over her braided hair, then bent to fold the blanket at the foot of the mattress so it would look neat when he woke. Small order was one of the few luxuries poverty had not yet stolen from her. The room was barely large enough for the mattress, a narrow table, a plastic chair with one leg wrapped in cloth for balance, and a rusted wardrobe that no longer closed properly. Her sewing machine sat in the corner like both a companion and a burden, black and old and stubbornly reliable. Beside it were 2 bundles of clothes clients had left for repairs, one school uniform needing a new zip, and a church blouse with a torn sleeve. Work, even small work, was grace. She filled a dented kettle from a bucket near the door and lit the paraffin stove. The smell was harsh, familiar, and impossible to remove from clothes no matter how many times she washed them. As the water warmed, she counted the coins inside a tin beneath the table. She did it quickly, without hope, only discipline. Rent was overdue again. The landlord had already warned her twice. School shoes for Luthando were thinning at the soles. Meal was low. There was enough for tea, enough for a little bread, and perhaps, if the woman from 2 streets over came as promised, enough money by evening to buy chicken feet for supper. Perhaps. In Thembeka's life, perhaps had become both companion and torment. When Luthando woke, he did not complain. That, more than anything, broke her heart. Some children opened their eyes and demanded cereal cartoons or soft uniforms ironed by busy mothers rushing toward stable jobs. Luthando rubbed his eyes, smiled sleepily, and asked, "Mama, is there tea?" "There is always tea," Thembeka said, and made her voice brighter than she felt. He sat cross-legged on the mattress, thin shoulders peeking from his oversized shirt, and watched her pour weak tea into enamel cups. She cut the bread into careful slices, making one piece look like 2. Luthando thanked her before eating. He had learned gratitude too early, and every time he said, "Thank you for something too small," Thembeka felt both proud and wounded. "Will you be at the market today?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "near the fabric stalls first. Then maybe by the taxi rank if there is more work. Can I come after school, if your teacher releases you on time? He nodded. I'll do my reading first. She smiled, then a real one, and reached to smooth his hair. My clever boy. He beamed in the way only he could, as if her words were richer than any gift, and for one dangerous second, she imagined a different life. A life with polished floors and proper breakfasts. A life where her son would never have to notice when she pretended not to be hungry. But imagination was a place she entered carefully. Too much of it could make reality harder to carry. By 7, she had washed Luthando at the outside tap, buttoned him into his uniform, and walked him to the school gate with a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. The streets were already alive with movement. Minibus taxis leaned into corners too fast. Vendors spread blankets over the pavement and arranged tomatoes, onions, socks, plastic toys, cheap chargers, and second-hand shoes. Men in reflective overalls drifted toward construction sites. Women in headscarves balanced bags and babies and burdens with equal practice. Johannesburg in that hour wore no softness. It was a city of urgency, of teeth of people learning to keep moving, no matter what the day took from them. Thembeka knew how to move in such a city without becoming hard like it. At the school gate, Luthando hugged her quickly, embarrassed now by affection in front of other children, then turned back just before going in. Mama, yes, when I grow up, I'm going to buy you a big shop, not just a machine in the corner. A real shop with glass. She laughed softly, though her throat tightened. Then I will sew the most expensive clothes in Johannesburg, and I'll sit there and chase away rude customers. Good, she said. Start with your spelling words. He grinned and ran through the gate. Thembeka stood for a second after he disappeared, gathering strength the way some people gathered prayer. The market district was already thick with heat by the time she reached it. She set up her machine, beneath a strip of shade, beside a woman who sold head wraps and another who repaired sandals. People knew her there. Not well enough to rescue her from hardship, but enough to trust the quiet quality of her hands. She hemmed skirts, tightened waistbands, patched children's trousers, and sometimes adjusted church clothes for women who wanted to look dignified before God, even if their cupboards were nearly empty. She charged little because those who came to her had little. It meant she was always working and almost never getting ahead. Around midday, an old man from the next lane stopped with a frayed jacket. How much for the sleeve, he asked. She turned it over gently, inspecting the torn seam. I can fix it for 20 rand. He winced. Can you do 15? She hesitated. 15 barely covered the thread, but she saw the shine worn off his shoes, the careful shame in the way he asked, and she nodded. Bring it by 4. He smiled in relief, as if she had saved more than a jacket. That was Thembeka's problem, people said. She was too soft, too willing to understand, too ready to reduce her own survival for someone else's temporary comfort. But life had taught her something harsher than business wisdom. The poor were often all each other had. Mercy moved sideways long before it ever moved down from the powerful. In the early afternoon, her neighbor Zanele arrived carrying a toddler with a feverish face. Panic shadowed her eyes. Thembeka, please, she whispered. Can you watch him while I go to the clinic? They say I have to register first for my mother, without even asking whether there would be payment. Thembeka shifted her basket and made space. Go. I'll keep him. For nearly an hour she worked with one foot on the sewing machine pedal and one eye on the restless child leaning against her side. When he cried, she paused to wipe his face. When he dozed, she draped her shawl over him, though the afternoon breeze had turned warm. Her own back ached, and she had eaten nothing since morning tea, but she kept sewing. Across the city, in a gleaming boardroom, high above the restless streets, Sibusiso Maseko was also being watched, though not with the tenderness given to children. Men in tailored suits studied his face as he listened to a quarterly report, with one hand resting on a leather briefcase near his chair. He was in his early 40s, tall, sharply composed, and famous in the kind of way that made other powerful men lower their voices when speaking his name. He owned logistics firms, property developments, renewable energy interests, and a philanthropic foundation that newspapers liked to praise when it suited them. People called him disciplined, brilliant, unyielding. Some called him cold. No one called him careless. Yet that morning, even while numbers appeared on the screen behind his finance director, his attention kept slipping toward the briefcase beside him. Inside it were papers no assistant had touched, no lawyer had reviewed, and no board member knew existed. A hospital file, old letters, one photograph that should have meant nothing anymore and yet still reached into him like a hand closing around a wound that had never healed properly. His younger sister, Ayanda, had been dead for years, but grief had strange ways of refusing burial. Some losses did not settle into memory. They remained alive in silence, waiting for the right moment to become unbearable again. When the meeting ended, Sibusiso closed the briefcase himself, fingers lingering for half a second longer than necessary over the lock, far below in the living city that fed the one he ruled from glass and steel. Thembeka packed away her thread as clouds gathered over Johannesburg. She lifted her sewing machine with both hands, exhaustion pressing into her shoulders, and started toward the taxi rank. She still needed to collect Luthando. She still had to think about supper. She still had to answer the landlord if he came again that evening. The day was not done with her. She did not know that somewhere ahead in the confusion of a crowded street and a moment of careless loss, her life and Sibusiso Maseko's were already moving toward each other. The next day began with the kind of sky Johannesburg often wore, before trouble pale and bright at first glance, but restless underneath as if heat and dust and impatience had already made an agreement before sunrise. Thembeka felt it in the air while she dressed Luthando for school, in the way voices outside were sharper than usual, in the speed of footsteps in the passage, in the landlord's knock that came too early and too hard. He stood in the doorway, broad stomach pressing against a faded golf shirt, keys jangling in one hand. "Mama Luthando," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "You told me end of the week." Thembeka kept one hand on Luthando's shoulder. "I know. I am still trying. You are always trying." There was no cruelty in his tone, which almost made it worse. Cruelty could be fought. Weariness could not. "Please," she said quietly. "Give me until Monday. I have 2 customers who still owe me. I will pay something." He looked past her into the room, at the machine, the thin mattress, the poverty so ordinary. It no longer shocked anyone. "By Monday," he said at last. "After that I cannot protect you from the owner's son. He wants new tenants." When he left, Luthando looked up at her with a seriousness too old for his face. "Are we being chased away?" Thembeka bent and adjusted his collar so he would not see the fear that flashed through her. "No, not today." He seemed to weigh the answer, then nodded because he loved her and wanted to believe what she said. After she dropped him at school, she headed toward the market with her sewing machine, balanced against her hip and a bag of clothes over her shoulder. The morning crowds were already swelling. A bus had broken down near the intersection, forcing taxis into one lane and sending commuters spilling onto the pavement in waves of annoyance. Street vendors shouted over engines. Hawkers pushed cigarettes, fruit sunglasses, and phone chargers with the urgent creativity of people who understood that every rand had to be hunted before sunset. Somewhere a siren cut through traffic thin and distant. Thembeka usually preferred order, routine, familiar corners where people knew her face. But that day one of the regular spots near the fabric stalls had been taken by a woman selling imported blankets, and another had flooded overnight from a burst pipe, leaving muddy water pooled over the pavement. She moved farther down than usual, closer to a busy road where office workers crossed between taxis and gleaming cars from the northern suburbs. It was not a place she liked, but it had shade for part of the morning, and enough foot traffic to promise work. By 10, she had repaired 2 school skirts and sewn buttons onto a men's shirt, while drinking water in careful sips to make it last. Business came unevenly, like mercy, never when one needed it most. Around noon, she packed away for a while and walked toward the corner shop to buy a small packet of peanuts. She planned to save half for Luthando. That was when the convoy came. People noticed it before they saw it. Traffic shifted strangely first, then security motorcycles appeared. Then 2 black SUVs slid through the congestion with the polished entitlement of wealth. Heads turned instinctively. In Johannesburg, power did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it arrived in tinted glass and the confident assumption that the road belonged to it. At the same time, a delivery truck ahead tried to force its way around a taxi that had stopped half in the lane. Horns exploded. A woman pushing a trolley veered suddenly to avoid a motorcycle. A fruit crate fell and oranges rolled into the street like marbles escaping a broken game. Commuters scattered, some annoyed, some amused, some furious. One of the SUVs braked sharply. The second swerved. For a few fractured seconds, the entire intersection seemed to lose its shape. Thembeka stepped back against a wall, clutching her bag. She saw a suited man climb out of the rear vehicle, with a phone at his ear, his face set in impatient concentration. He was tall, controlled, and dressed in a charcoal suit that looked as if it had never known dust. Even in confusion, there was a stillness about him that made other people shift around his presence without meaning to. She did not know his name yet, but she felt at once that this was a man used to being obeyed. Security men moved quickly around him, creating space, one of them guiding him toward the pavement, while the others shouted at motorists and passers-by. Someone argued, someone laughed, someone cursed the rich loud enough for others to hear. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the knot of movement loosened. The man stepped toward another waiting vehicle, farther up the road, still speaking into his phone, and disappeared behind the open door. Within less than a minute, the convoy was moving again. The street, however, took longer to settle. A taxi driver leaned out his window swearing. A woman bent to gather bruised oranges. Pedestrians resumed walking with that strange dignity city people developed after public inconvenience, as though pretending not to have been interrupted. Restored some small piece of control, Thembeka was about to return to her machine when she saw it. A dark leather briefcase lay half beneath the curb just beyond a line of parked cars. At first she thought someone nearby must have dropped it in the commotion. She looked around, expecting a man in office shoes to come running back. No one did. The case was expensive, even to eyes that had never owned anything like it. The leather was smooth, the metal edges polished, the handle thick and firm. It looked heavy, important, out of place on a dirty Johannesburg roadside. Thembeka picked it up, because leaving it there felt impossible. It was weightier than she expected. That told her at once that it was not empty. Documents, perhaps. A laptop. Money. Something important enough that the owner would panic the moment he realized it was missing. Her heart began to beat harder. For one unreasonable second, she imagined taking it home and doing the thing desperate people sometimes dreamed about and decent people feared themselves for imagining. She pictured rent paid in advance, Luthando in new shoes, a proper bed, meat in the pot more than once a month. Her machine replaced with a newer one that did not jam every third seam. The image came fast, bright, almost cruel in its sweetness. Then shame followed, because the truth was not only that she needed help. The truth was also that the briefcase was not hers. And another truth, deeper and more painful, sat beneath that one. If she crossed this line, she would have to live inside herself afterward. Poverty had taken comfort, status, ease, beauty, and safety from her. She would not hand it the last thing it had not managed to steal. A young man selling sunglasses nearby noticed the case in her hands. "Mama, that one is worth something," he said with a low whistle. "You are blessed today." Thembeka tightened her grip. Did you see who dropped it? He grinned. Why ask that question? Because I am returning it. He looked at her as though she had announced that she intended to throw bread into a river. Returning it. To who the road? She ignored the sarcasm. The man from the cars. Did you see where they went? He jerked his chin toward the northbound lane. Those rich people, city side. Maybe Santon, maybe offices. Why they won't even thank you. That she thought was probably true. Still, she tucked the briefcase beneath her arm, rushed back for her sewing machine and bag, then hurried to the woman with the head wrap stall. Mam Nandi, please. Can you watch these until I come back? I need to find someone. The older woman looked from Thembeca to the briefcase and back. Trouble. No, Thembeka said, though she was not sure. I just need to do the right thing. Mam Nandi muttered something under her breath about right things rarely feeding children, but she agreed. Thembeka started with the obvious place, the security company logo she had glimpsed on one of the men's jackets. She asked a parking attendant, then a traffic officer, then a woman selling Vetcoek near the corner. Most shrugged. One man told her to mind her business. Another suggested she open the case and keep whatever was inside, before the owner blamed her anyway. A taxi marshal finally recognized the convoy. That was Maseko, he said. Big man. Maseko Holdings, where he pointed toward the business district. Tower building with the gold sign. But sister, if you walk in there carrying that, be careful. Those people don't ask questions nicely. By then the afternoon sun was pressing hard against the city. Sweat dampened the scarf at Thembeka's neck. She checked the time and felt panic rise. She still had to collect Luthando from school. For a second she almost turned back, but something in her refused to hand the briefcase to a stranger or leave it with police who might never log it properly. Valuable things disappeared every day in systems built to misplace poor people and protect important ones. So she changed course, collected Luthando first, and told him they needed to make a stop before going home. He looked at the briefcase. Is that yours, Mama? No. Then why are we carrying it? Because it belongs to someone else. He considered this with the solemn acceptance children sometimes gave to moral lessons still too large for them. Are we giving it back? Yes. He slipped his small hand into hers. Good. The trip to the city center felt longer than it was. By the time the tower of Maseko Holdings rose before them, all reflective glass and guarded doors and polished stone, Thembeka felt the weight of her clothes, her shoes, her accent, her poverty, her whole life pressing against her skin. She became suddenly aware of the scuff on Luthando's left shoe, the fraying cuff of her skirt, the way reception areas in places like this could make people like her feel as though they had entered by mistake. She stood outside for one steadying breath, then another. Above the entrance, the company name gleamed in gold. Luthando looked up. Is this where the owner lives? No, she said softly, but it is where powerful people keep their things. Then, holding the lost briefcase in one hand and her son's fingers in the other, Thembeka stepped toward the doors of Maseko Holdings, not knowing that suspicion was already waiting for her on the other side. The glass doors of Maseko Holdings did not open with warmth. They parted with quiet precision, as if responding only to people who belonged there. Thembeka hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside her hand, tightening around Luthando's fingers. The cool air hit her skin immediately, carrying the faint scent of polished floors and something expensive she could not name. It was a different world from the dust and heat outside, controlled, silent, and watchful. People turned. Not openly, not all at once, but enough that Thembeka felt it. Eyes moved from her worn skirt to her faded scarf, from her tired sandals to the child at her side, and then most of all to the briefcase in her hand. Suspicion did not need to be spoken in places like this. It existed in posture, in glances, in the slight tightening of lips. She approached the reception desk slowly. The woman behind it was elegant, her hair pulled into a smooth bun, her nails polished in a soft, neutral color that probably cost more than Thembeka earned in a week. Her smile was professional, but it disappeared the moment she fully registered who stood in front of her. "Yes," the receptionist asked, her tone already edged. "I need to see someone." Thembeka said, steady but respectful, "This was lost outside. I believe it belongs to your boss." The receptionist's eyes dropped to the briefcase, then snapped back up. "Where did you get that?" "It fell during traffic earlier. I came to return it." There was a pause, brief but heavy. "Wait here," the receptionist said. She did not invite Thembeka to sit. Instead, she picked up the phone and spoke in a lower voice, her eyes never leaving Thembeka, as though she might run. Within moments, 2 security guards appeared from a side corridor. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions neutral in the way of men trained to assume the worst first and ask questions later. "Ma'am," one of them said, extending his hand. "We'll take that." Thembeka instinctively pulled the briefcase slightly closer to her body. "I would prefer to give it directly to the owner." That was when the shift happened. The air around them hardened. "You don't get to make that decision," the second guard said. Luthando pressed closer to her leg, sensing tension he did not fully understand. "I am not here to cause trouble." Thembeka said, her voice still calm but firmer now. "I found it. I walked all the way here. I just want to return it properly." The receptionist's lips tightened. "You people always say that." The words landed sharper than a slap. Before Thembeka could respond, a woman's voice cut through the space from behind them, smooth but cold. "What exactly is going on here?" Thembeka turned. Nomfundo Khumalo approached with measured steps, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She was striking, composed, dressed in a fitted blazer that framed her authority as much as her posture did. Everything about her suggested controlled discipline and a complete intolerance for disorder, especially the kind that walked in wearing dust and uncertainty. The receptionist straightened. "Ms. Khumalo, this woman claims she found Mr. Maseko's briefcase." Nomfundo's gaze settled on Thembeka, like a quiet examination. "And you thought the best thing to do," Nomfundo said slowly, "was to walk into a corporate headquarters carrying it yourself." "I thought the best thing to do was return it," Thembeka replied. Nomfundo tilted her head slightly, studying her more closely now. Or perhaps she said, her voice softening in a way that felt more dangerous. "You thought you could bring it here, create a scene, and negotiate something." Thembeka's chest tightened. "No. Then why insist on handing it over personally?" Nomfundo pressed. "Because it is not mine," Thembeka said, "and I wanted to make sure it reaches the right person." Nomfundo let out a quiet breath, almost amused. "That is a very noble story." There it was again, that tone. Not loud, not openly cruel, but dismissive in a way that reduced Thembeka's honesty to something naive, almost foolish. "Take the briefcase," Nomfundo said to the guards. This time one of them stepped forward more decisively. Thembeka did not fight, but she did not let go immediately either. "Please," she said, looking directly at Nomfundo now. "Let me just confirm it is his. Then I will leave." Nomfundo's eyes flicked briefly to Luthando, then back to Thembeka. Something like calculation moved behind her gaze. "Fine," she said at last. "Bring her." Thembeka felt a small, unexpected surge of relief. They led her through corridors that gleamed with glass and steel, past offices where people worked behind transparent walls, their conversations muted, their worlds ordered. Everything here spoke of structure of power, contained and directed. It made her feel both invisible and exposed at the same time. Luthando held her hand tightly. "Mama," he whispered, "are we in trouble?" "No," she said quietly. "We are doing the right thing." They stopped outside a large office at the end of the hallway. Nomfundo entered first. Inside, Sibusiso Maseko stood near the window, one hand resting against the glass as he looked out over the city. From this height, Johannesburg seemed almost peaceful. Its chaos softened into distant motion. He turned when Nomfundo spoke. "Sir," she said, "we have a situation." His eyes moved to the briefcase in the guard's hand before they landed on Thembeca. Recognition came slowly, then sharply. He stepped forward. "Where did you get that?" "It fell during the traffic incident earlier," Thembeca said, holding his gaze despite the weight of his presence. "I came to return it." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Sibusiso took the briefcase himself this time. His fingers moved quickly over the lock, opening it with practiced familiarity. The room seemed to hold its breath as he lifted the lid. Everything appeared intact. Documents stacked neatly, a leather folder, a sealed envelope. Then his hand paused. He stared at the contents of the envelope as if something inside it had reached out and struck him. His expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that others might immediately understand, but enough that the shift could not be ignored. The calm authority he carried cracked just slightly, revealing something unsettled beneath. "What is it?" Sir Nomfundo asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked back to Thembeca, studying her, measuring something invisible. Then just as quickly, the moment closed. "It's fine," he said. He shut the briefcase. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Nomfundo relaxed slightly. "Should I have security?" No, Sibusiso interrupted. He looked at Thembeca again, but whatever he had seen before was gone, now replaced by distance. "You can go," he said. That was all. No thank you, no acknowledgement, no understanding of what it had taken for her to stand there. Thembeca felt something sink quietly inside her. She nodded once because dignity sometimes meant accepting less than what was deserved without begging for more. Then she turned, guiding Luthando back toward the door. As they walked out, the building seemed colder than before. Behind them, inside the office, Sibusiso remained standing with the briefcase in his hands, his thoughts no longer in the room, because the face of the woman who had returned it, her eyes, her voice, something in the way she held herself, refused to leave him. And the envelope inside the briefcase suddenly felt heavier than it had in years. Thembeca did not speak for the first few minutes after leaving Maseko Holdings. She walked with one hand around Luthando's shoulder, and the other gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her fingers began to ache. The city moved around them as if nothing important had happened. Taxis shouted for passengers. Office workers crossed the street with coffee in hand. A vendor argued over change. Somewhere nearby, music spilled from a radio in cheerful defiance of other people's troubles. Johannesburg had no habit of pausing for private wounds. It expected people to gather themselves while still walking. Luthando looked up at her twice, before finally asking, "Did we give it back?" "Yes," she said. Was the man happy? The question pierced more deeply than she expected. She kept her eyes on the pavement. He took it. Luthando frowned in thought, trying to make sense of the answer. "Did he say thank you?" Thembeca forced a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "No, but that is not why we returned it." He seemed to accept that, but his face remained serious. Children understood more than adults liked to admit. He had seen the guards watching her. He had felt the coldness in the building, even if he did not know how to name it. He had watched a powerful man dismiss his mother as though honesty were a small inconvenience rather than a gift. They walked to the taxi rank in silence. Thembeca's humiliation did not burn hot anymore. It had settled into something heavier and quieter, the kind of pain that sat inside the ribs and made breathing feel like work. She had not expected praise. Life had trained such expectations out of her long ago. but she had not expected to feel as if her integrity itself were under suspicion, as if she had carried the briefcase there, not with effort and conscience, but with some hidden scheme stitched into the folds of her skirt. By the time they reached home, the light had begun to soften. The mechanic's yard behind the rooms smelled of oil dust and old metal. Children chased each other between buckets and broken tires. A woman rinsed laundry in a plastic basin while keeping one eye on a pot balanced over a paraffin stove. Everything looked painfully ordinary, and Thembeka was grateful for that. Ordinary was safer than hope. Inside the room, she set down her bag and knelt to light the stove. There was a little mealy meal left, enough to make pap thin enough to stretch and still call it supper. She moved with automatic care, stirring the pot, while Luthando sat on the mattress, doing his reading aloud in a quiet, deliberate voice. "Mountain," he said, sounding out the syllables. "Minute. Together. Good," Thembeka murmured. He kept reading and she kept stirring, and for a while the room became bearable again because routine had returned. Routine did not heal, but it steadied. After they ate, she washed the pot, rinsed their cups, and checked the coins in the tin again, though she already knew what they would tell her. Still, not enough. Monday was getting closer. Need had a way of standing at the door, even when one tried not to look toward it. Later, when Luthando had fallen asleep, she sat beside the sewing machine under the yellow light of a weak bulb and finished the school uniform zip she had promised that morning. The needle rose and fell. Thread tightened. Cloth moved beneath her hands. Work had always been the one place where her mind could settle, because fabric did not lie. Torn seams could be seen. Broken edges could be repaired. If the work was done well, it held. Human beings were not so simple. Yet even while she worked, her thoughts returned to the office tower. The guards, the receptionist's voice. The woman named Kumalo, whose eyes had stripped her of dignity before she even opened her mouth. And then, there was the man himself, Sibusiso Maseko. She had not known his name when she walked into the building, but she knew it now. People in the yard spoke of rich men the way village people once spoke of storms or chiefs as forces large enough to shape many lives without ever touching most of them directly. When she had described the company, the mechanic 2 doors down had laughed softly and said, "That is Maseko, big man. Those people don't see us unless we are under their cars." But Thembeka kept thinking less about his wealth than about the moment when he opened the briefcase. He had changed, only for a second, perhaps less. But she had seen it. Something inside that case had not merely mattered to him. It had struck him. His face had gone still, in a way that did not belong to business documents or lost property. It had looked like memory, or grief, or fear. Thembeka did not know which, only that something in that briefcase had weight beyond money. She should have let the thought go. It was not her business. His secrets had nothing to do with her. Yet the image remained. Across the city on the upper floor of a house so large it seemed designed to protect its owner from the noise of ordinary life, Sibusiso Maseko sat alone in his study with the briefcase open on the desk in front of him. The room was lined with books he rarely had time to read and windows that overlooked a lit garden, trimmed into effortless beauty by people whose names he did not know well enough. A decanter sat untouched on the sideboard. His phone had rung 3 times in the last half hour, once from Nomfundo, once from legal, once from his older brother, and he had ignored all of them. His attention was fixed on the envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly worn at the edges from years of being opened and returned, opened and returned. Inside were copies of medical records from Street, Anne's Women and Children's Hospital, a place that no longer existed under that name because it had merged, rebranded, and quietly buried its worst years beneath a cleaner public image. There was also a photograph of Ayanda holding her swollen belly and smiling with the exhausted brightness of a woman trying to believe that suffering would soon turn into joy. She had been 24 then, too trusting, too determined to handle things alone, too alive to be remembered only by paper. Sibusiso picked up the photograph and stared at it until the edges blurred. Ayanda had died 8 years earlier. Officially, it had been complications after childbirth. Unofficially, the truth had never sat properly with him. Too many gaps, too many hurried explanations, too much pressure from people who wanted the matter closed before it could become an embarrassment. At the time, he had been expanding the company, fighting off predatory partners, dividing his attention between growth and family in the arrogant way successful men often believed they could. By the time he realized how much had been concealed from him, grief had already hardened into silence. And now that silence had cracked open again. Because tucked between the hospital copies was a handwritten note he had added years ago after hiring a private investigator who died before finishing the work. It contained only fragments. A nurse's name, a date, a mention of another woman delivering in the same ward that night under irregular circumstances. Records altered, a child listed twice then not at all. The information had never been enough to prove anything. Only enough to disturb. Today, when he opened the briefcase in front of that poor woman from the street, his eyes had fallen not just on the photograph, but on a name scribbled in the margin of one photocopied form. Thembeca. He stood abruptly and went back to the desk, pulling the page closer again, as if it might say something different under stronger light. There it was. Not a full certainty, not proof. Just a line in old handwriting next to a bed allocation note. Transferred next to T. Dlamini before midnight. Dlamini. The surname alone meant little. South Africa was full of Dlaminis. But when he had looked up and seen the woman who returned the case, something old and instinctive had tightened inside him. Not recognition exactly. Something less rational. A sense that a door long closed had moved slightly on its hinges. He sat down again and pressed his thumb against his temple. He hated uncertainty. It was one of the few things money could not make obedient. Numbers could be audited. Contracts could be enforced. Disloyal men could be removed. But the past had its own cruelty. It resurfaced when it wanted, and rarely in forms that could be controlled. A knock came at the study door. Study. He did not answer, but a second later, it opened anyway. Nomfundo entered, carrying a slim folder, and the composed expression she wore whenever she believed she was about to restore order. "Sir, I thought you would want the incident report." Sibusiso did not look up immediately. "What incident?" the woman Nomfundo said. "The one who came with your briefcase." That made him lift his head. She walked to the desk and placed the folder down. Security reviewed the lobby footage. There was no breach beyond her entry, but I felt it best to document everything. In these situations, people sometimes return items in order to create contact. Later, they ask for favors, money work, something more. Sibusiso's face gave nothing away. "Did she ask for anything?" Nomfundo paused. "No, but that does not mean she won't." He leaned back slightly. "What is her name?" Nomfundo blinked, perhaps surprised by the question. "We did not take full details, only that she said she found the case during the traffic delay." "You brought her into my office without confirming her name." The rebuke was mild, but it landed. Nomfundo's voice tightened by a degree. "I was trying to recover your property efficiently." Sibusiso let the silence sit between them just long enough to remind her that efficiency was not the same thing as judgment. Then he opened the folder. The printed incident notes were neat, factual, impersonal. Female, approximate age, accompanied by minor child, claimed to have found item. No aggressive behavior, no name. When he closed the folder again, something had already shifted in his mind. He did not yet know why that mattered. He only knew he wanted to. "Find her," he said. Nomfundo frowned. "Sir, the woman. Find out who she is." "For what purpose?" Sibusiso's gaze cooled. I don't remember asking you to evaluate the purpose. She straightened. Of course. But when she left, she did not leave unaffected. In all the years she had worked beside him, she had learned the difference between passing curiosity and genuine interest. This was not the first. It was the second. And second thoughts in powerful men often led to inconvenient changes. After the door closed, Sibusiso returned to Ayanda's photograph. Outside, the lights of Johannesburg burned across the dark like countless lives, refusing disappearance. Somewhere among them, a woman named Thembeka Dlamini was sewing by weak light, counting coins, raising a child, and perhaps trying to forget the humiliation of returning what was never hers. Sibusiso looked again at the handwritten note in the margin of the hospital record and felt something he had not allowed himself in years. Not peace, not certainty, but the dangerous beginning of questions. Johannesburg woke heavy the next morning as if the city itself had not rested. Thembeka felt it in her bones before she even opened her eyes. There was a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with the quiet accumulation of worry. Monday was closer now. Rent still unpaid, work uncertain, and somewhere beneath all of it the lingering sting of the previous day refused to fade. But she rose anyway, because that was what life demanded of people like her. Luthando woke with a small cough, rubbing his chest as he sat up. Thembeka noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "I'm fine," he said quickly, the way children often did when they sensed their mothers were already carrying too much. She touched his forehead. No fever, but his breathing was slightly tight, the kind of small discomfort that could grow into something worse if ignored. Thembeka's stomach tightened. Clinics meant time. Time meant lost work. Lost work meant lost food. Every small decision in her life came with invisible consequences. Still, she made a quiet choice. "If it gets worse, we go to the clinic," she said gently. He nodded, though she could see the hesitation in his eyes. He understood more than she wished he did. After taking him to school, Thembeka returned to the market, but her focus was not the same. Her hands moved over fabric, but her mind drifted. She found herself replaying the scene in the office again. Not with anger now, but with something closer to confusion. Why had he looked at her like that? Not when she first entered. That had been cold, distant, practiced. But later, when he opened the briefcase, there had been a moment. A pause. A shift. As if something in that case had connected to something in her, though she could not understand how or why. She shook the thought away. It did not matter. Rich men had complicated lives. Their secrets had nothing to do with her. Her world was simple: find work, feed her child, survive one day at a time, without losing herself in the process. By midday, the market was loud again. A woman argued over the price of tomatoes. A young man laughed too loudly at something no one else found funny. A preacher shouted about repentance from the corner, his voice rising above engines and bargaining and the constant hum of movement. Life in all its noise was easier than silence. That was when she saw him. At first, she did not recognize him. He stood across the street, dressed differently from the previous day. No sharp suit, no polished shoes catching the light. Instead, he wore a simple dark shirt and trousers, the kind that would not attract attention in a crowd. But there was something about the way he stood still, observant, separate from the chaos, that made her look twice. Then she realized. Sibusiso Maseko. He was watching her, not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but deliberately enough that it could not be mistaken. For a moment, Thembeka felt a flicker of irritation. Yesterday she had stood in his world and been treated like a problem. Today, he stood in hers, uninvited. She lowered her eyes and continued working. If he wanted something, he could come forward like any other person. Across the street, Sibusiso remained where he was. He had not planned to come himself. Normally, this kind of task would have been delegated. A name, an address, a file placed neatly on his desk. But something about the situation had unsettled him enough to act outside his usual patterns. Nomfundo had already begun making inquiries. It would take time. Time he suddenly found himself unwilling to wait for. So he came. And now that he stood there watching Thembeka in her environment, the contrast struck him more sharply than anything from the day before. This was her world. Not the polished floors of his office, not controlled spaces where voices were measured and appearances carefully maintained. Here, everything was exposed. Noise, struggle, negotiation, survival. It all lived openly, without disguise. And in the middle of it she worked. Not performing, not seeking attention, simply working. He watched the way she spoke to customers, calm and respectful, even when they tried to lower her prices beyond reason. He watched how she paused to help an elderly woman adjust her bag, how she smiled at a child who wandered too close to her machine, how she gave back 2 coins to a man who had overpaid without noticing. It unsettled him, because there was no audience here. No advantage, no gain, just character. After several minutes, he crossed the street. Thembeka noticed him approach, but did not stop what she was doing. She finished the seam she was working on, cut the thread, cleanly, and only then looked up. Yes, she said. Not rude, not warm, neutral. It was not the tone he was used to. You came to my office yesterday, Sibusiso said. I did. You returned something valuable. Yes, and you left without asking for anything. She met his gaze steadily. I told you yesterday. It was not mine. There was no pride in her voice. No attempt to impress. Just a statement of fact. Sibusiso nodded slightly as if confirming something for himself. What is your name? He asked. Thembeka. He waited. She did not offer more. Dlamini, she added after a moment. Not out of obligation, but because silence felt unnecessarily defensive. Something in his expression shifted again. Do you always work here? He asked. When there is space, she said. Otherwise, wherever I can. He glanced at the sewing machine. And this is enough. Thembeka almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. It is what I have. A pause settled between them, but it was different from the silence in his office. This one was not filled with suspicion. It was filled with something more complicated. You should have kept the briefcase, Sibusiso said suddenly. The words were unexpected. Thembeka's eyes sharpened slightly. No. You need money. Yes. You could have changed your situation. She shook her head. Once. Not like that. Sibusiso studied her. Why the question was simple, but it carried weight. Thembeka held his gaze. Because then I would have to live with myself, she said. The answer landed harder than he expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. He had built an empire on decisions, on calculated risks, on understanding how people moved when money was involved. He had seen loyalty, bought silence, negotiated integrity, bent under pressure. But this was something else. You think that matters? He asked quietly. She did not hesitate. It is the only thing that matters when everything else is taken from you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Around them the market continued without pause. Someone shouted about prices. A taxi revved its engine. A child laughed somewhere in the distance. Life did not stop for realizations. Finally, Sibusiso reached into his pocket and took out a business card. If you ever need work, he said, placing it on the edge of her table, come to the foundation office. Ask for Mr. Ndlovu. Thembeka looked at the card, but did not pick it up immediately. I don't want charity, she said. It's not charity, he replied. It's an opportunity. She considered that. Then slowly she took the card. For my son, she said. Sibusiso nodded once. For your son. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. He looked back. Did you ever give birth at St. Anne's Hospital? He asked. The question hit her like a sudden drop in the ground beneath her feet. For a second she could not speak. Her fingers tightened around the card. "Yes," she said finally, her voice quieter now. When he pressed, "Years ago," she replied. Why but Sibusiso did not answer. Because in that moment, the fragile line between coincidence and truth had begun to break, and neither of them yet understood how much it would cost. The question did not leave with him. It remained. It stayed in the air long after Sibusiso walked away, long after his figure disappeared into the moving crowd, long after the market swallowed him, the way it swallowed everything that did not belong. Thembeka stood still for a few seconds, the business card resting between her fingers, her mind struggling to follow what had just happened. St. Anne's Hospital. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in years, not because she had forgotten it, but because she had trained herself not to remember. "Madame," a customer's voice pulled her back. "Are you still fixing this, or should I take it somewhere else?" Thembeka blinked, grounding herself. "No, I will fix it." She lowered her eyes to the fabric, but her hands were not as steady as before. The needle slipped once, then again. She paused, exhaled slowly, and forced herself to focus. Work. She needed to work. Thinking about the past would not pay rent. It would not feed Luthando. It would not change anything. And yet, her thoughts refused to obey. St. Anne's. She could see it now whether she wanted to or not. The peeling paint, the smell of antiseptic mixed with something older, something neglected. The overcrowded ward where beds were too close together and privacy did not exist. The tired nurses, the long waiting hours that stretched into fear. She remembered pain. She remembered voices speaking over her, not to her. She remembered a moment of sharp, blinding exhaustion. And then silence. They had told her the baby did not survive. Just like that. No explanation that made sense. No chance to hold the child properly. No goodbye that felt real. Only a statement delivered in the flat tone of people who had said the same words too many times to feel them anymore. She had cried then. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just quietly, as if her grief itself needed to be small enough not to disturb anyone. And after that, life had not stopped. It never did. She had returned to the world with empty arms and a wound no one could see. People expected her to move forward, to survive, to continue. So she did, because survival did not ask for readiness. It demanded action. Now, years later, that memory had been dragged back into the present by a man who had no right to touch it. Why had he asked that Thembeka tightened her grip on the fabric in front of her? No, she would not go there. She finished the repair, handed it back to the customer, and forced her mind back into the rhythm of the day. One job, then another, then another. By late afternoon, her back ached. Her fingers were sore, and the coins in her tin had grown slightly heavier, but still not enough. Never enough. When she went to collect Luthando, she found him sitting quietly under the jacaranda tree, near the school gate. His book open on his lap, but his attention elsewhere. He looked up when he saw her, and for a moment his face lit up the way it always did. Then he coughed. It was small. But Thembeka noticed. She knelt beside him. "You are still coughing. I'm okay," he said quickly. "You said that this morning." He shrugged. "It's nothing." She touched his chest lightly. His breathing was still not right. Not dangerous yet, but not something to ignore either. "We go to the clinic," she said. His face fell slightly. "Now, yes." He did not argue, because he trusted her, because children like him learned early that some things were not optional. The clinic was crowded. It always was. Rows of plastic chairs filled with mothers, babies, elderly men, tired workers, all waiting with the same quiet patience that came from knowing there was no faster way. Thembeka took a number and sat with Luthando beside her, his small body leaning against hers. Time moved slowly there. Too slowly. She watched the nurses move in and out. She listened to names being called. She counted how many people were ahead of them. Each minute felt like something slipping away. Time she could have spent working money she was not earning, responsibilities, piling quietly in the background. But she stayed. Because Luthando mattered more. When their turn finally came, the nurse checked him, quickly asked a few questions, and prescribed medication for a chest infection that was just beginning. "Catch it early," the nurse said. "It won't become serious." Thembeka nodded, relief washing through her in a quiet wave. How much, she asked at the pharmacy window. The number given was small, and still it hurt. She paid, because she had no choice, because mothers did not measure cost when it came to their children's breath. By the time they returned home, the sky had darkened. The mechanic's yard was quieter now, the noise replaced by low conversations and the occasional sound of metal settling after a long day of use. Inside their room, Thembeka helped Luthando take his medicine, then sat beside him as he lay down. "Mama," he said softly. "Yes, are we going to be okay?" The question was simple, but it carried everything. Thembeka smoothed his hair gently. "Yes," she said, not because she was sure, but because he needed her to be. He nodded, closing his eyes. Within minutes, he was asleep. Thembeka remained sitting beside him, her hand still resting lightly on his shoulder. In the quiet of the room, her thoughts returned again. To the market, to the man, to the question. St. Anne's Hospital. Why did it matter to him? What was inside that briefcase that made his face change like that, and why, out of everything he could have said, had he asked about that place? She reached into her bag and took out the business card. It was simple, clean, white, Maseko Foundation, Mr. Ndlovu. She turned it over between her fingers. Opportunity, he had said. Not charity. Thembeka stared at the card for a long moment. Then she placed it carefully on the table beside her sewing machine. Not discarded, not accepted. Just there. Because something in her life had shifted. She did not yet understand how. She did not yet understand why. But she could feel it. The quiet before something changed. Across the city, in a high office where silence carried more weight than noise, Sibusiso stood looking at the same file he had opened too many times over the years. This time he did not close it, because now there was a name. Not just on paper, but alive, walking, breathing, and somehow connected to a past that refused to stay buried. He picked up his phone. "Nomfundo," he said, when she answered. "Yes, sir. I want everything you can find on a woman named Thembeka Dlamini." A pause, then understood. Sibusiso ended the call. Outside his window, Johannesburg stretched endlessly, filled with lives that crossed and collided without meaning. But sometimes, just sometimes, those collisions were not accidents, and when they weren't, they changed everything. The morning after the clinic visit felt slower, as if time itself had softened to give Thembeka space to breathe. Luthando's cough had eased slightly after the first doses of medicine, though his voice still carried a faint rasp that made her listen closely every time he spoke. She walked him to school with more care than usual, her hand resting protectively at the back of his neck, as though she could guard him from everything the world might try to take. "Drink water," she reminded him at the gate. "I will," he said. "And don't run too much." He smiled. "I never run too much. You always run too much." He laughed softly, then hesitated. "Mama, are you going to that office today?" Thembeka paused. "The one from the card," he added. She looked at him for a moment, surprised. "No," she said, "not today. Maybe you should." He said carefully. The man didn't look bad. She almost asked what he meant, but stopped herself. Children did not judge the same way adults did. They felt things differently, sometimes more honestly. "I will think about it," she said. That seemed enough for him. He nodded and disappeared through the gate. Thembeka stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked back toward the market. But her pace was slower, because she was thinking. The card remained in her mind like something unfinished. Not urgent, not demanding, but present. She had seen opportunities before, or things that looked like them. Most came with conditions, expectations, or hidden costs. Nothing in her life had ever arrived clean. Still, there was something about the way Sibusiso had said it. Not charity, opportunity. She reached the market and set up her machine, but her focus drifted again. She stitched unevenly, once then corrected it. Her hands knew the work even when her mind wandered. By late morning, business was steady, enough to keep her occupied, enough to quiet the constant counting of money in her head. A young woman brought a dress that needed tightening. A man asked for his trousers to be patched. A schoolgirl waited patiently, while Thembeka replaced a broken button on her uniform, watching every movement with quiet fascination. "Can you teach me?" the girl asked suddenly. Thembeka looked up. "To sew," the girl added. "Like you." Thembeka smiled faintly. One day, the girl beamed as if that promise meant something real. Moments like that mattered more than they should have. They reminded her that even in struggle, something could still be given. Around midday, the market shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but noticeably. A small crowd gathered near the food stalls. Laughter rose, voices lifted. Something had changed. Thembeka glanced up. Sibusiso was there again. But this time he was not standing at a distance. He was sitting on a low plastic chair beside an old woman selling roasted mealies. It looked almost absurd. A man who belonged to glass towers and controlled environments, sitting in the dust, holding a paper-wrapped mealie in his hand, listening as the woman spoke animatedly about something that made him nod occasionally. He did not look uncomfortable. He did not look out of place in the way people often did when they entered spaces they did not understand. He looked present. Thembeka frowned slightly. She had expected distance, observation, control. Not this. She returned her focus to her work. If he wanted to speak to her again, he would come. She would not go to him. Time passed. Eventually he did. He approached without urgency, without the invisible force that had surrounded him in his office. Here he moved like any other man navigating the narrow paths between stalls. When he reached her, he did not speak immediately. He watched her finish what she was doing. Waited. That more than anything caught her attention. When she finally looked up, her expression was neutral. "You came back," she said. "Yes." Why? Sibusiso considered the question, then answered simply, "Because I had more to understand." Thembeka tilted her head slightly. "About what about you?" he said. She did not react immediately. Instead, she tied off her thread, set the fabric aside, and wiped her hands on a cloth before meeting his gaze again. "There is nothing to understand," she said. "There is always something," he replied. She almost smiled at that, but held it back. "You are not like most people I meet," he continued. "That is because you do not meet people like me," she said. The statement was calm, not bitter, but it carried truth. Sibusiso did not deny it. "That may be true," he said. A small silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but careful. Then unexpectedly, Luthando appeared. He had been released early from school and had come straight to the market as he sometimes did. When he saw Sibusiso standing there, he slowed slightly, observing him with the open curiosity of a child. "This is the man," he said to Thembeka. She nodded. Sibusiso looked down at him. "And you are Luthando." They shook hands. Properly. Sibusiso noticed that. "You are taking your medicine?" Thembeka asked. "Yes," Luthando said. "You must finish it." "I will." Sibusiso watched the exchange quietly. Something about it simple, ordinary, unguarded, felt unfamiliar in a way he could not immediately explain. "You take care of him well," he said. Thembeka's expression softened slightly. "I try. That is not something everyone does." "No," she said, "but it should be." Again that truth. Simple, uncomplicated, and yet rare. Sibusiso looked at the sewing machine. "At the foundation," he said, "we have a small textile program. Training equipment, stable work. It is not charity." Thembeka glanced at the card still resting in her memory. "You said that already," she replied. "And you did not come." "I was busy surviving." He nodded once. "That is exactly why you should come." She studied him carefully. "You are not used to being told no," she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. Sibusiso allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "No, I am not," and yet she continued. "You came back anyway." "Yes. Why this time?" He did not answer immediately. Because the truth was not simple. Because it was not just about curiosity anymore. Because something deeper had begun to move, and he did not yet have the language for it. Finally, he said, "Because I believe your life should not look like this." The words hung in the air, heavy, unintended, honest. Thembeka's expression changed. Not in anger, not in offense, but in something more guarded. "My life looks like this because it is my life," she said. "I know, and it is not for you to decide what it should be." Sibusiso held her gaze. "You are right," he said. The answer surprised her. Most people in his position would have argued, corrected, explained. He did none of those things. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, but this time he did not offer another card. He placed something else on the table. A folded paper. "Go to the foundation tomorrow," he said. "Ask for Ndlovu. This will get you in." Thembeka looked at it, did not touch it. "I will think about it," she said. "That is enough." He turned to leave. But Luthando spoke. "Are you coming back again?" Sibusiso paused, then looked at him. "Yes," he said. Because now, whether he fully understood it or not, this was no longer something he could walk away from. The paper Sibusiso left behind did not look important. It was not embossed. It did not carry a gold seal or any of the visible markers people often associated with power. It was a simple sheet folded once with a short note and a signature that meant nothing to anyone who did not know the man who wrote it. Yet to Thembeka, it felt heavier than the briefcase had. She did not open it immediately. She placed it beside her sewing machine and continued working as if nothing had changed. A woman brought a torn church skirt. A young boy needed his trousers shortened. Life moved in its usual rhythm, and Thembeka followed it because routine was safer than decision. But every few minutes, her eyes returned to the paper. Luthando noticed. "Mama," he said quietly, "you are thinking too much." She almost laughed. "When do I not think too much? When something is important," he replied. She looked at him. He was watching her carefully now, not as a child, but as someone trying to understand something bigger than himself. "You should go," he added. "To the foundation, yes." "Why?" He shrugged slightly. "Because you are afraid." Thembeka blinked. "I am not afraid," she said. "Yes, you are," he replied gently. "But not of them." She waited. "Of something changing," he said. The simplicity of it struck her harder than any argument could have. Children did not complicate truth. They stepped directly into it. Thembeka looked away. He was right. Not entirely, but enough. Because change had never been kind to her. Every time something shifted in her life, it had taken more than it gave. Loss had arrived disguised as opportunity before. Trust had cost her. Hope had disappointed her. Stability, when it appeared, had always been temporary. So yes, she was afraid. Not of Sibusiso, not of the building, but of what might come after. That night after Luthando slept, she finally unfolded the paper. The note was short. Please assist. S. Maseko beneath it was a time and a location. Maseko Foundation. 8:30 a.m. Thembeka stared at the words for a long time. Then she folded the paper again, carefully, deliberately, and placed it under the sewing machine. As if anchoring it, there would keep it from pulling her life too far in any direction. The next morning, she woke earlier than usual. Not because she had decided, but because she could not sleep. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier. Even the familiar sounds outside seemed distant, as if her mind had already stepped somewhere else. She dressed, Luthando prepared his tea, walked him to school. Everything normal, everything the same, and yet not the same. At the school gate, he looked at her again. "You're going," he said. It was not a question. Thembeka hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes." He smiled. Not excited, not surprised, just certain. "I'll wait for you at the market," he said. She touched his cheek. "Go to class first." "I will." He ran off, and this time when he looked back, it was not with worry. It was with something closer to trust. The Maseko Foundation building was smaller than the corporate headquarters. Still modern, still clean, but different. Less intimidating, more open. The kind of place designed to feel accessible, even if the power behind it remained the same. Thembeka stood outside for a moment, then walked in. This time the receptionist did not look at her with suspicion. She looked at the paper. And everything changed. "Please," she said, standing immediately. "Go through. Mr. Ndlovu is expecting you." Thembeka felt it again, that shift, the invisible line between being ignored and being acknowledged. It was unsettling, because nothing about her had changed, only the paper in her hand. Mr. Ndlovu greeted her with a warm smile that felt genuine in a way she was not used to. "You must be Thembeka," he said. "We've been waiting." She nodded, slightly unsure how much to say. He did not press. Instead, he showed her around. The textile section. Rows of machines, women working. Some older, some younger, all focused, all steady. "This program trains women," Ndlovu explained, then employs them. Fair wages, stable contracts. Thembeka listened. Carefully. Why, she asked. "Why what, why me?" Ndlovu smiled faintly. "Because someone believes you belong here." She knew who that someone was. "And if I don't?" she asked. "Then you leave," he said simply. No pressure, no obligation, just choice. That was new, too new. She walked through the room slowly, observing the women, the work, the order of it all. No shouting, no bargaining, no constant negotiation for survival, just structure. It felt unreal, and yet possible. Back at the corporate office, things were not as calm. Nomfundo stood in front of Sibusiso's desk, a file open in her hands. "I've found her," she said. Sibusiso looked up. Thembeka Dlamini, age 32, single mother, informal worker, no criminal record, no formal employment history. "Family," he asked. "Minimal, no documented partner, one child, lives in Yepistown." Sibusiso nodded slowly, and the hospital Nomfundo hesitated. That was unusual. "What is it?" he asked. "There is overlap," she said carefully. He leaned forward slightly. "Explain." Nomfundo turned the page. "St. Anne's Hospital. Same night your sister was admitted." Silence. Heavy, deliberate. And he pressed. "She delivered a child that night." Sibusiso's jaw tightened. "The record states the child did not survive." "And you believe that?" Nomfundo paused, then said nothing, because they both knew records could lie, especially when money was involved, especially when power needed silence. Sibusiso leaned back slowly. Everything was beginning to connect. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. Enough to make it impossible to ignore. At the foundation, Thembeka stood in front of an empty machine. Ndlovu watched her quietly. "You can try," he said. She hesitated, then sat. Her hands rested on the fabric. Familiar, comforting. She pressed the pedal. The machine moved, smooth, effortless. Nothing like the one she used at the market. For a moment, just a moment, something inside her shifted. Not hope, not yet. But something close. Something that felt like the beginning of a different kind of life. She stopped, looked at the fabric, then at Ndlovu. "I don't want favors," she said. "This is not a favor," he replied. "It feels like one. It feels like opportunity," he corrected gently. She stood, stepped back, looked at the room again, then nodded once. "I will come back tomorrow," she said. Not a commitment, but not a refusal either. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Across the city, Sibusiso stood by his window again. But this time, he was not looking at the city. He was looking at the past. And for the first time in years, he was no longer willing to leave it buried. The night after Thembeka's visit to the foundation did not bring rest. It brought memory. She lay on her thin mattress beside Luthando, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing as the medicine began to ease his chest. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of the city and the occasional metallic clatter from the mechanic's yard. But inside her mind, there was no quiet at all. St. Anne's Hospital had returned, not as a distant shadow, but as something vivid, immediate, and impossible to push away. For years she had survived by folding that part of her life into a place she rarely opened, not because she had forgotten, but because remembering had once threatened to break her completely. Grief, when left untouched, had a way of settling into the body like a second spine. It held you upright, but it also kept you from bending, from changing, from feeling too much. Now something had disturbed it. A question. A name. A look in a man's eyes that had not matched the rest of him. She turned slightly, watching Luthando sleep. His chest rose and fell steadily now, safe, present, alive, her son, her only child, and yet, not her first. The thought came without warning, and once it arrived, it would not leave. She closed her eyes, and the past opened. The ward had been too bright. That was the first thing she remembered. Not the pain, not the fear, but the light. It had been harsh, unkind, refusing to soften anything it touched. Thembeka had lain on a narrow bed, her body exhausted, her mind, drifting between clarity and confusion. Voices moved around her, nurses, patients, someone crying, someone laughing in a way that did not belong in a place like that. She had been alone. That was the second thing. No mother, no partner, no familiar hand to hold. Only strangers. She had been younger then. Not a girl, but not yet the woman she had become. Life had not hardened her fully. She still believed that if something went wrong, someone would explain it properly. That pain had purpose. That systems, even broken ones, would still care enough to do things correctly. She knew better now. But that night she had believed. The pain had come in waves, sharp and overwhelming, pulling her out of herself again and again. She remembered gripping the edge of the bed, her breath uneven, her voice small even when she tried to make it strong. A nurse had told her to push. Another had told her to wait. Someone had argued. She did not understand. Time had blurred, and then there had been a moment, a shift, a release. The sound of something new entering the world. She had heard it. She was sure of that. A cry, faint but real. Her heart had surged toward it instinctively. "My baby," she had whispered, but no one had placed the child in her arms. No one had shown her anything. Instead, there had been movement, quick, efficient, detached. She remembered trying to lift her head. please, she had said, but her body had not obeyed. The exhaustion had been too deep. The room had tilted. Darkness had pressed in. And when she woke, everything was different. They didn't make it. The voice had been calm. Too calm. Thembeka had stared at the nurse. What she had asked, the baby, the woman had said. There were complications, no explanation, no detail, just a conclusion. Thembeka had waited, for more, for something. Nothing came. "Can I see?" she had begun. But the nurse had already turned away. "Rest," she said. "There's nothing to see, nothing to see." The words had stayed with her, for years, because something about them had never felt right. Grief had come slowly, not in one moment, but in many. In the empty space where a cry should have been. In the silence where there should have been breathing beside her. In the absence of a child, she had felt carried known. She had cried, quietly. Not because she did not feel deeply, but because there was no space for loud grief in a place that moved too quickly to notice it. And then, she had been discharged, sent back into the world. Alone, with nothing but a memory that did not fully make sense. Thembeka opened her eyes. The room returned, small, familiar, real. But the past did not fade as easily as before, because now there was doubt. Not new doubt, but awakened doubt. The kind that had always been there, buried beneath survival. She sat up slowly, looked at Luthando again, her son, the child she had fought to protect every day since. But now there was another question, one she had never allowed herself to fully ask. What if the first child had not died? The thought was dangerous. Because hope, when misplaced, could destroy what little stability she had built. Because chasing ghosts could cost her the present. Because believing something like that without proof could break her again. And yet Sibusiso's question had not come from nowhere. St. Anne's, the same night, the same place. Her chest tightened. She stood, moving quietly so she would not wake Luthando, and walked to the small table where the folded paper from the foundation rested. She touched it lightly, then withdrew her hand. Because everything felt connected now. The foundation, the man, the question, the past. It was no longer just about opportunity. It was about truth. And truth was something she had learned to fear almost as much as she needed it. Across the city, Sibusiso sat in his study again. But this time he was not alone. The file lay open between him and Nomfundo. She stood across from him, composed as always, but there was tension beneath her calm now. "This is speculation," she said carefully. "It is connection," Sibusiso replied. "It is coincidence." He looked at her. "Do you believe that she hesitated? Because she did not. Not entirely. But belief was not the point. Control was. And if it is more than coincidence," she asked. "Then we find out," he said. "And if what we find is inconvenient," the word hung in the air, heavy, loaded. Sibusiso's expression did not change. "Then we deal with it." Nomfundo watched him closely. Something had shifted. Not just curiosity, not just interest. Something deeper, more dangerous. "You are letting this become personal," she said. "It was always personal," he replied quietly. She closed the file. "Then be careful," she said. Of what? Of what you are willing to lose to find the truth." Sibusiso did not answer, because the answer was already forming, and it was not one she would approve of. Back in her small room, Thembeka lay down again beside her son. But she did not sleep, because for the first time in years, the past was no longer behind her. It was moving toward her, and she could feel it, slowly, inevitably, coming back to life. By the time morning came, Thembeka had made no clear decision, only a quiet commitment to keep moving. That was how she survived most turning points in her life. Not with certainty, but with motion. She rose before dawn, prepared Luthando's tea, checked his breathing, and listened for the cough that had kept her awake through the night. It was softer now, less sharp. She let herself feel a small, careful relief. "You'll go to school?" she asked him. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on her face, as if searching for something more. "And you, I will go to the foundation," she said. The words surprised even her. He smiled, not widely, just enough. The Maseko Foundation felt different in the morning light. There was a quiet order to it that contrasted sharply with the restless urgency of the streets outside. People arrived with purpose. Doors opened without suspicion. Voices were low-focused. This time, Thembeka did not hesitate at the entrance. The receptionist recognized her immediately and directed her inside without question. The same invisible shift from the day before remained. She was no longer just a woman from the street. She was someone expected. That unsettled her, because nothing about her life outside had changed. Inside, Mr. Ndlovu greeted her again, this time with a sense of confirmation rather than introduction. "I was hoping you would come back," he said. "I said I might," she replied. "That is enough," he said. He did not ask why. He did not ask what had changed. Instead, he placed a simple form in front of her. "Temporary placement," he explained. "Training with stipend. If you choose to continue, we discuss long-term work." Thembeka looked at the paper. Her name, printed. A place ready for her. It felt unreal. "You can start today," Ndlovu added. She hesitated only briefly, then nodded. Work inside the foundation did not feel like the market. There was structure, order, expectation. The machines were modern, responsive, precise. The fabrics were better. The environment quieter. There was no shouting, no bargaining, no constant fight to prove value. Instead, there was a rhythm guided by schedules, standards, and mutual respect. At first, it made Thembeka uncomfortable. Too smooth, too controlled. But as the hours passed, something else emerged. Relief. Not overwhelming, not immediate, but present. For the first time in a long time, she was not calculating every minute in terms of survival. She was simply working, and that alone felt like a kind of luxury. The other women noticed her quickly, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. "Where did you come from?" one asked. "The market," Thembeka replied. The woman nodded. "You sew like someone who had to learn fast." "I did," another woman smiled. "Then you will do well here," it was said. Without competition, without judgment, just recognition. That more than anything unsettled Thembeka, because she was used to being measured, compared, dismissed, not accepted. By midday she had found her rhythm. Her hands moved confidently. Her focus returned. For a few hours, the weight of her life lifted just enough for her to feel something she had almost forgotten. Stability. It was fragile, temporary, but real. Across the city, instability was growing. Nomfundo stood in the boardroom, reviewing financial discrepancies that had surfaced overnight. Foundation accounts, one of the analysts said. Small irregularities. Nothing large but consistent. Nomfundo's eyes narrowed. "Explain. Funds allocated to community programs. Some records don't match internal transfers." She said nothing at first, but her mind was already moving, because irregularities, even small ones, were rarely random. They pointed somewhere, and in systems like this, they could be used. By the afternoon, Thembeka's presence at the foundation had not gone unnoticed. Not by the staff, not by Ndlovu, and certainly not by Nomfundo. When she arrived unannounced, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Her presence carried authority, control, expectation. The women straightened slightly. Conversation softened. Work continued, but with awareness. Nomfundo walked through the textile section slowly, her eyes scanning everything with practiced precision. Then she saw her, Thembeka, working, focused, present. Nomfundo stopped. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she stepped closer. "You," she said. Thembeka looked up. Their eyes met again. But this time the setting was different. The power dynamic had shifted. Not entirely, but enough. "You are working here now?" Nomfundo asked. "Yes." On whose authority? Thembeka did not answer immediately. Because the answer was obvious and unnecessary. Nomfundo's gaze sharpened. "I see," she said. There was no warmth in her voice, no approval, only calculation. "You should be careful," she added. Thembeka's expression remained calm. "Of what?" "Of misunderstanding your position." The words were soft, but clear. Thembeka met her gaze without flinching. "I don't misunderstand," she said. Nomfundo studied her, then smiled slightly, not kindly. "Good," she said, and walked away. By the time Thembeka left the foundation that evening, the air outside felt heavier again. Not because of the work, but because something had changed again. This time not quietly, not invisibly, but directly. Nomfundo had seen her, and that mattered, because women like Nomfundo did not ignore things that disrupted order. They corrected them. At the market, Luthando was waiting. He spotted her immediately and ran. "Mama." She caught him easily, pulling him into a quick embrace. "How was it?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Different. Good different." She thought about it, then nodded. "Yes." He smiled, and for a moment that was enough, but not for long. Because later that night, as Thembeka counted her coins, now slightly more than before, but still not enough, the landlord knocked again. Harder this time. "You said Monday," he reminded her. "It is Monday," she said quietly, and the money she placed, what she had in his hand. It was not enough. They both knew it. He sighed. "I will speak to the owner," he said. "But this cannot continue. I understand." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded, and left. Inside, Thembeka sat down slowly. Luthando watched her. "We're still here," he said. "Yes, but maybe not forever." She did not answer, because she did not know. Across the city, Sibusiso stood in his office again. But this time he was not thinking about the past. He was thinking about the present, about Thembeka, at the foundation, in his world, and about the reaction it had already triggered. Nomfundo's reaction, the system's reaction, the beginning of resistance. He understood it, because systems did not like disruption, and Thembeka, whether she realized it or not, was becoming exactly that, a disruption, and disruptions always came with consequences. Thembeka's second day at the foundation began before the sun had fully settled into the sky. She woke with the familiar weight of responsibility pressing gently against her chest, but beneath it, something else moved, something quieter, steadier. Not hope exactly, not yet, but a sense that the ground beneath her feet had shifted, even if only slightly. She dressed quickly, prepared Luthando's breakfast, and checked his medicine. His breathing was stronger now. The cough had softened into something less threatening. "You are better," she said. "I told you," he replied with a small smile. She almost laughed. "You said you were fine." "That too." She shook her head, then paused. "I may come home late today," she added. "Stay close to Mamnandi after school." "I will." He hesitated, then said, "Mama, don't let them send you away." Thembeka looked at him. "I won't," she said. But the truth was, she didn't know if that was something she could control. At the foundation, the atmosphere had changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Thembeka felt it the moment she walked in. The same space, the same machines, the same women, but something beneath the surface had shifted. Conversations paused a second longer when she passed. Glances lingered just a bit more. Not hostile, but aware. She took her place at the machine without comment. Work. That was where she belonged. Not in questions, not in speculation, but in the quiet certainty of her hands. Still, the feeling remained. Across the building, Nomfundo stood in Ndlovu's office. "You didn't inform me," she said. Her tone was controlled, but firm, and Ndlovu met her gaze calmly. "It was approved. By whom you already know the answer." Nomfundo's jaw tightened slightly. "This is not procedure. This is instruction. From him." "Yes." Silence settled between them. Then Nomfundo stepped closer. "You are compromising the structure of this program," she said. "We have criteria. We have processes. We do not just bring in people because they caught his attention." And Ndlovu did not react immediately, then said, "We bring in people who deserve opportunity. That is not the same thing. It should be." Nomfundo exhaled slowly. This was not about policy. This was about control. And control was something she did not surrender easily. "Watch her," she said finally. "Closely." And Ndlovu's expression did not change. "I already am, but not for the reasons she meant." Back in the textile section, Thembeca worked steadily, focused, grounded, until the interruption came. A supervisor approached. "Can you come with me?" she asked. Thembeca looked up. Why, there's a question about inventory. It sounded routine, normal, and yet something in the tone felt off. Still, Thembeca stood, followed, because refusing would only create more attention. The room they led her to was smaller, closed, less open than the rest of the foundation. Nomfundo stood inside, waiting. Thembeca stopped just inside the doorway. "This won't take long," Nomfundo said. Her voice was calm, controlled, but there was no softness in it. "There's been a discrepancy," she continued. "Funds allocated to this department, materials unaccounted for." Thembeca frowned slightly. "I don't handle money." "No," Nomfundo agreed, "but you do handle materials. Fabric, thread, supplies." Thembeca understood immediately. "This has nothing to do with me," she said. Nomfundo tilted her head. "Maybe not," she replied, "but you are new, and situations like this, they require clarity." Thembeca held her gaze. "I have taken nothing," she said. "I didn't say you did, but you are implying it." Nomfundo smiled faintly. "I am investigating." The word settled heavily in the room. Investigation, not accusation. Not yet, but close enough. Thembeca felt something rise inside her. Not fear, not panic, something steadier, stronger. "You already decided," she said quietly. Nomfundo's expression did not change. "I am giving you a chance to explain." "There is nothing to explain." "Silence. Then search her locker," Nomfundo said. The words landed like a blow. The supervisor hesitated, but only for a second, then moved. Thembeca stood still, watching, not resisting, because resistance would only confirm what had already been decided in someone else's mind. The locker opened. Items were moved, checked, handled without care, and then a pause. The supervisor pulled something out, an envelope, thick, unfamiliar. Thembeca's heart skipped. "That's not mine," she said immediately. Nomfundo took the envelope, opened it. Inside cash, neatly stacked, enough to matter, enough to accuse. The room went very quiet. Nomfundo looked at her. "This is a problem," she said. Thembeca's voice remained steady. "It's not mine. It was in your locker. I didn't put it there." Nomfundo stepped closer. "And yet here it is." Thembeca met her eyes, unflinching. "Then someone else put it there." "Why would someone do that?" The question hung between them. Sharp, calculated. Thembeca didn't answer immediately, because the answer was obvious and dangerous. Instead, she said, "You tell me." Nomfundo smiled again, but this time there was something colder in it. "We will need to suspend you," she said. The words came clean, final, until this is resolved. Thembeka felt the weight of it, not just the accusation, but what it would cost. Work, stability, the small shift her life had just begun to make. All of it. Gone. Again. Luthando, rent, everything, and yet, she did not break. "I didn't take it," she said. Nomfundo nodded. "We will see." By the time Thembeka stepped back into the open floor, the room had changed. Everyone knew. No one spoke. But the silence said enough. She walked back to her machine. Slowly, packed her things, carefully, without rushing, because dignity was the only thing she could still carry with her. Outside, the air felt heavier, the city louder, more unforgiving, as if it had been waiting for this, as if it knew. Thembeka walked without direction at first, then toward the market, because that was where she belonged, where she had always belonged. Across the city, Sibusiso received the report. Short, direct, efficient, discrepancy, cash found, subject, Thembeka Dlamini, suspended pending investigation. He read it once, then again. His expression did not change, but something inside him did, because he knew immediately this was not random, this was not coincidence, this was design. And only one person would move this quickly, this precisely. Nomfundo. Sibusiso stood, slowly, deliberately, because now this was no longer about the past, or the briefcase, or unanswered questions. This was about the present, about injustice, about a woman who had done the right thing and was being punished for it. Again. And this time he would not stand at a distance. Thembeka did not cry on the way back to the market. Not because she did not feel the weight of what had just happened, but because she had learned something. Long ago. Tears were a private language not meant for streets that swallowed weakness and turned it into spectacle. So she walked steady and quiet, her bag over her shoulder, her mind moving faster than her steps. The noise of Johannesburg returned to her like a familiar storm. Taxi horns, voices calling out prices, engines idling in frustration. The market did not pause to ask what she had lost that afternoon. It simply continued. Mamnandi saw her first. "You're back early," the older woman said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in Thembeka's expression. "What happened?" Thembeka placed her bag down slowly. "Work ended. That is not what your face is saying." Thembeka hesitated. Then quietly, they said, "I took something." Mamnandi's eyes hardened immediately. "Did you?" "No." "I know," the older woman said without hesitation. That simple certainty almost broke something inside Thembeka, because real belief was rare. "Sit," Mamnandi said. But Thembeka shook her head. "I need to work. You need to breathe. I need money," Thembeka replied. The words were not sharp, just true. Mamnandi said nothing after that, because there was nothing to argue with. Thembeka set up her machine again. Same place, same hands, same work. But something had changed. The rhythm felt heavier now. Each stitch carried more than fabric, it carried frustration, exhaustion, the quiet anger of someone who had done everything right and still been pushed back to where she started. Again, when Luthando arrived, he knew immediately. Children always did. "Mama," he said softly. She looked up, forced a small smile. "I'm here." He walked closer. "Did they send you away?" Thembeka held his gaze. "Yes." He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He simply nodded, then said, "It's okay." She blinked. "It's not okay," she replied gently. "It will be," he said. Thembeka stared at him for a moment, because hope sounded different coming from a child. It sounded lighter, less complicated, less afraid. She reached out and pulled him close. For a second, just a second, she allowed herself to rest in that. Across the city, Sibusiso did not go home. He went to the foundation, unannounced, unscheduled. And when he walked in, the shift was immediate. Staff straightened, conversation stopped. Authority did not need to introduce itself. It was recognized. And Ndlovu met him halfway. "Sir, Sibusiso didn't waste time. Where is she?" And Ndlovu understood immediately. "She left." Why a pause? Then there was an accusation. Sibusiso's jaw tightened. "I read the report. Then you know." "No," Sibusiso said. "I know what was written. I want to know what happened." And Ndlovu held his gaze. She was set up. The words landed clean, without hesitation, without doubt. Sibusiso exhaled slowly. "I thought so." Nomfundo entered the room moments later. Composed, controlled, prepared. "You came quickly," she said. "I always do," Sibusiso replied. Their eyes met, and for the first time there was tension that could not be hidden. "You handled the situation," he continued. "Yes, without informing me. It was operational, it was personal." Nomfundo's expression sharpened slightly. "Everything is personal when you choose to make it so." Sibusiso stepped closer. "Did you put that money in her locker?" The question cut through everything. Direct, unavoidable. Nomfundo didn't flinch. "I acted in the interest of the organization." "That's not an answer. It is the only one that matters." Silence. "Then you crossed a line," Sibusiso said quietly. Nomfundo's voice lowered. "So did you." The air between them tightened. "This is not about policy anymore," she continued. "You are bringing someone into a system that does not operate on emotion." "She is not the problem," Sibusiso replied. "No," Nomfundo said. "She is the symptom of what happens when you let personal history interfere with structure." The words hit closer than she intended, because they were not entirely wrong. Sibusiso didn't respond immediately, because he knew. This was no longer just about Thembeca. It was about everything beneath it. The past, the hospital, the file, the truth that was beginning to surface. And Nomfundo was standing directly in the way. "Reverse the suspension," Sibusiso said finally. Nomfundo shook her head. "I can't do that. You will." "No." The word landed firmly. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Sibusiso said, "You're done." Nomfundo blinked. "What with this matter," he clarified. "You're removed." Her expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. "You're making a mistake," she said. "Maybe," he replied. "But it's mine to make. And when this backfires, it won't. You don't know that. I know enough." Silence. Then Nomfundo straightened. "Then we will see," she said, and walked out. But not defeated. Not yet. Back at the market, evening settled slowly. Thembeka packed her things with the same quiet care she always did, because routine was still all she had, until a car stopped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. People noticed. They always did. Sibusiso stepped out. This time he didn't observe from a distance. He walked straight to her. Thembeka didn't look surprised. She simply finished folding the fabric in her hands. Then said, "You came." "Yes." "Why? Because this isn't finished." She studied him. "You believe me?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt, just truth. That was new. "You shouldn't," she said quietly. "I should," he replied, "because I know how this works." She held his gaze. "And what will you do?" Sibusiso paused. Because this was the moment, the shift, the line between involvement and commitment. Then he said, "I will fix it." Thembeka shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "You don't fix things like this." "I do." "Not this." Silence. "Then what do you want?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. Thembeka didn't answer immediately, because for the first time she had a choice. Not just survival, not just reaction, but choice. Finally, she said, "I want the truth." Sibusiso nodded. "Then that's what we find." Above them the city moved, unaware, unchanged. But beneath the surface, something had shifted again. And this time, there was no going back. The truth did not arrive gently. It came in fragments, first documents, reopened names, revisited signatures examined under sharper light. Sibusiso moved quickly, now not with the detached precision of a businessman solving a problem, but with the urgency of a man whose past had begun to breathe again. He brought in external auditors, legal investigators, and a retired medical consultant who had once worked within the old St. Anne's system before it dissolved into something cleaner, something harder to trace. For the first time in years, the past was no longer protected by silence. It was being questioned. Thembeka did not return to the foundation immediately, not because she was afraid, but because she understood something important now. This was no longer about a job. It was about something deeper, something that could not be approached halfway. She remained at the market, working as she always had, but her mind no longer moved, only in the present. It stretched backward, connecting pieces she had once forced apart. The night, the ward, the cry she was sure she had heard, the absence that followed. And now, a man with power, asking the right questions. She did not trust easily, but she trusted what she had felt that night, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she had not been wrong. 3 days later, Sibusiso returned. Not alone. This time he carried something, a file. He approached her without hesitation. "We need to talk," he said. Thembeka looked at him, then at the file, then nodded. They sat in a small, quiet space behind the market stools, away from noise, away from watching eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Sibusiso opened the file. Inside, records, photographs, statements, things that had been hidden, things that had been buried, things that had never been meant to surface again. "This is St. Anne's," he said. Thembeka's chest tightened. "I know. These are records from the night you gave birth." Her hands moved slightly, unconsciously. "What do they say?" she asked. Sibusiso didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned the page. "There were 2 births in that ward within the same hour," he said. Thembeka's breath slowed. "One was you, and the other," she asked. "My sister." The words landed heavily. Ayanda Maseko, the name she had never known, the connection she had never imagined. "She died that night," Sibusiso continued. "That's what we were told." Thembeka nodded slowly. "That's what I was told too," she said. Silence. Then Sibusiso turned another page. "But the records don't match," he said. Thembeka leaned forward slightly. "There are inconsistencies," he continued. "Names altered, time entries changed, a child listed twice, then removed." Her heart began to beat faster. "What does that mean?" she asked. Sibusiso met her eyes. "It means someone changed the truth." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. "What happened?" Thembeka whispered. Sibusiso didn't soften it. "Your child didn't die," he said. The words broke something open. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Thembeka sat very still, because if she moved, if she reacted, it would become real. "No," she said quietly. "Yes, no," she repeated, shaking her head slightly now. "You don't know that. I do. You think you do. I've confirmed it," how she demanded. Sibusiso reached into the file, pulled out a photograph, placed it in front of her. Thembeka looked down, and the world shifted. It was a child, older, not a baby, a boy, around 8 years old, standing beside a woman she did not recognize, dressed well, healthy, alive. Thembeka's hands trembled. "This is—" She couldn't finish. "This is the child listed under your hospital," Sibusiso said. Her breath caught. "No. He was transferred," Sibusiso continued, "illegally, sold through a network tied to the hospital." Thembeka's vision blurred. They told me he died. They told you what they needed to. Tears came then, not loud, not broken, but unstoppable. Because grief, real grief, was not always explosive. Sometimes it was quiet, slow, heavy, and impossible to hold back. How she whispered. Sibusiso's voice hardened. Corruption, he said. Money, influence, families who wanted children without questions. Thembeka closed her eyes. My child, he's alive. The words echoed, again, 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 alive. Something inside her struggled to understand that, to accept it, to believe it. Because believing it meant everything changed. Everything. And, my sister, Sibusiso said slowly. Thembeka looked at him. She didn't die from complications, he continued. She died because something went wrong, and they covered it. Silence. 2 lives, 2 truths, 1 night, connected, hidden, stolen. Where is he? Thembeka asked. Her voice was stronger now, not steady, but determined. Sibusiso hesitated. Because this part was complicated. He was adopted, he said. By who? A private family, where Sibusiso held her gaze. Close, he said. Thembeka's chest tightened again. What does that mean? It means... He paused, then finished. He's been in this city, the weight of it settled. Not far away, not lost, not gone. Here, alive, growing, living a life that should have been hers to witness. Tears returned, but this time they carried something else. Not just grief, but something sharper, something stronger, truth. Who did this? She asked. Sibusiso didn't hesitate. We know names, he said. Doctors, administrators, people who thought no one would ever look back. And now, he said they answer. Thembeka sat back slowly. Her world had been small, contained, focused on survival. Now it had expanded beyond anything she had prepared for. I want to see him, she said. You will, when soon. She nodded, because now there was no fear left, only need. And the woman who framed me, she asked. Sibusiso's expression darkened slightly. She's part of it. Thembeka looked at him, not surprised, just understanding. Of course she is, she said quietly. Outside the city continued, unaware, unchanged. But beneath it, truth had broken through. And once truth surfaced, it could not be buried again. Sibusiso closed the file. This ends now, he said. Thembeka looked at him. No, she said. This begins. Because this time, it wasn't just about justice. It was about a child, a life, a truth that had waited too long to be seen. And now there was no stopping it. The day Thembeka finally saw her child again did not begin with certainty. It began with fear. Not the kind she had known before, of hunger, of eviction, of being judged and dismissed, but something deeper, more fragile. The fear of truth. The fear that what she had dared to believe might still be taken from her again. The fear that after all these years, reality might not match the fragile hope now growing inside her. She dressed slowly that morning, carefully, not because she had better clothes, but because the moment demanded respect. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied her scarf. She paused more than once, breathing through the weight in her chest. Luthando stood beside her, watching. You're shaking, he said gently. Thembeka smiled faintly. I know. Are you scared? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. He reached for her hand. It's okay, he said. She looked at him, her son, the one she had raised, the one who had never left her side, the one who had grown through every hardship with her and felt something inside her steady. Yes, she whispered. It is. Sibusiso arrived on time, not early, not late. as if even this moment had to be handled with precision. He stepped out of the car and approached her without the distance he once carried. There was no authority in his posture, now no sense of control, only purpose. "Are you ready?" he asked. Thembeka took a breath. "No," she said honestly, then added, "But I'm going." He nodded, because readiness had nothing to do with it. The house was not what she expected. It was large, beautiful, quiet, but not cold. There was life in it, care, the kind that came from presence, not just wealth. Thembeka stood at the gate for a moment before entering. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of the distance, but because of what waited at the end of it. Inside, a woman stood waiting, mid-40s, well-dressed, composed, but not unkind. This was the adoptive mother, the woman who had raised the child, taken from Thembeka. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was no hostility, only understanding. "You are Thembeka," the woman said. "Yes." A pause. "Then I didn't know," the woman said quietly. Thembeka held her gaze. "I believe you," she replied, because she did. Because not everyone in the chain of injustice had been aware. Some had simply accepted what they were given, and built love on top of it. "His name is Thabiso," the woman said. Thembeka's breath caught. Thabiso, a name she had never spoken, a name she had never chosen. And yet, her child, alive, real. "Here, can I?" she began. The woman nodded. "Yes." He entered, slowly, unaware, curious. 8 years old, tall for his age, eyes alert, strong, healthy. Everything she had imagined and more. Thembeka didn't move at first, because if she did, it would become real, and real was overwhelming. Thabiso looked at her, then at Sibusiso, then back again. "Who is she?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried everything. Thembeka's heart broke quietly, because she had no place in his understanding, no name in his world. Not yet. Sibusiso stepped forward. "This is someone important," he said. Thabiso frowned slightly. How Sibusiso hesitated. "Because truth, real truth, could not be rushed. Because she's part of your story," he said. Thabiso looked at Thembeka again, longer this time, studying her. Something flickered, not recognition, but curiosity, connection. Thembeka took a step forward, slowly, carefully. "My name is Thembeka," she said softly. He nodded. "I'm Thabiso." She smiled through tears. "I know." Silence settled. Not empty, not uncomfortable, but full. Of history, of absence, of everything that had been lost and everything that was still possible. Later explanations would come. Truth would be shared, carefully, gently, over time. But for now, this moment was enough, because presence was the beginning. Across the city, consequences unfolded. The investigation moved quickly now. Names were exposed, records revealed. The hospital's past resurfaced in full. Doctors, administrators, middlemen, all tied together by money, by silence, by the belief that no one would ever look back. They were wrong. Charges were filed, licenses revoked, careers ended, because truth, once uncovered, did not stop. Nomfundo stood in her office, alone. The reports in front of her told a story she could no longer control. Connections traced, transactions uncovered, her name close enough to the center. Not fully exposed, but not untouched. For the first time, she was not in control. And she understood something then. This had never just been about Thembeka. It had been about everything she had built, everything she believed in. Order, control, structure, and now it was all shifting. Back at the house, Thembeka sat quietly, watching, listening, feeling. Thabiso spoke easily with the woman who had raised him. Comfortable, safe, loved, and that mattered more than anything. Because despite everything he had not suffered. He had not been broken. He had been cared for. Thembeka closed her eyes briefly, gratitude and grief mixing in a way she could not separate. Sibusiso stood nearby, watching both of them, understanding more now than he ever had before. This was not something he could fix, not completely, not perfectly, but it was something he could stand in, support, protect, allow to unfold the way it needed to. Thembeka looked at him. "This doesn't erase anything," she said. "I know, but it changes everything." "Yes." She nodded slowly, then turned back to Thabizo, her son. Not lost, not gone, just returned. Outside the city moved as it always had, unaware, unchanged. But for Thembeka, everything was different, because the truth had come. Not gently, not easily, but completely, and with it something she had never expected to feel again. Not just survival, not just endurance, but healing.
Sometimes life does not break us in loud, dramatic ways. Sometimes it takes something quietly, something precious, and leaves us to carry the absence without answers. And for many people, especially those without power, those answers never come.
Thembeka's story reminds us that doing the right thing does not always bring immediate reward. In fact, it can bring suspicion, humiliation, and loss. But integrity has a way of planting seeds in places we cannot see.
And when the time is right, those seeds can grow into truth, into justice, into restoration. This is also a story about how systems can fail the most vulnerable and how silence can protect injustice for years. But it is also a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can still rise. And when it does, it carries both pain and healing with it. If this story touched your heart, tell us, where are you watching from, and what time is it in your country right now? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your voice matters. And if you believe in stories about justice, hope, and second chances, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the stories we tell are the ones that help us heal.